Anything else that's apropos to our getting to know you, please feel free. But the floor is yours, Stephen.
Thank you. Yeah, let's get started. And I'm going to just run you a little bit through some of the ideas in terms of my research, some of my findings, and then I'm going to turn it over to you to address any of the specific questions that you have. So this is going to be a bit more general, and then you can ask specific questions. Okay. Can you just allow me to share my screen?
Um, Yeah, we're going to do that right now for you, Stephen. Okay.
Okay,
Okay. So he's a co-host. Okay.
great.
Should be able to do it now.
Yeah, I can. Great. Okay, go.
Okay.
Uh, suck. All right. So let's take a look at this. How well did 15-year-old students in Canada do on the PISA test? And we can see here that this is between 2003 and 2022. Mathematics, reading, and science, not very encouraging. Um, Here's the rest of the OECD countries. And one should keep in mind that this is even with countries that haven't experienced this kind of decline, like Taiwan, Hong Kong, uh, South Korea. And even still, you see these precipitous declines. I mean, it's even by 2003 declining in most of them. Reading is a bit of an exception. But then around 2012, 2015, you see a real precipitous decline. Now, one thing you'll often see is in Canada, the media will say, well, we're doing the same. We have nothing to worry about. We're doing the same as the other OECD countries. But when you take a look at what the other OECD countries are doing, um, then we see the problem. And where this comes from is the fact that all of these countries have adopted the same paradigm. By paradigm, I mean sort of view of education in terms of its purpose and then how what its content is and what it's delivered. Something that originated in the United States, which was never known for its fantastic public education system in general. And we see the predictable results that we followed in their footsteps. So let's get started and take a look at these paradigms. So the first one that we're going to talk about that guides public education is rationalism. And this was kind of what took hold in Canada up until the mid to late 1970s. Rationalism is also known by other terms such as traditionalism. You might hear a classical liberal curriculum. But when I'm talking about these paradigms, I'm talking both about the curriculum, the what you're teaching, and the pedagogy, how you're teaching. So under rationalism, you're talking about the teacher as the focus of the classroom, as the expert in the room who knows his or her subject matter that is being conveyed to the students in ways that help the students learn. And the role of the teacher is really to get the students to mastery, and if not mastery, at least to fluency. So here, if you look at my diagram on the left, we have the dependent child. They're subjected in public schooling to expert training in knowledge. So that's your history of knowledge, the skills that go along with those areas of knowledge, the attitudes and behaviors that are necessary for learning. And this is all done, this is all the teacher's responsibility. And the subject matters are reading, writing, mathematics, history, social studies, geography, etc., etc. The teacher has to ensure that all the students are learning in tandem. It's whole classroom instruction. There's no assumption that parents are going to be running a homeschool after hours. It's the teacher's responsibility. There's frequent testing to make sure that the children are actually learning what they're being taught. And then it's applied in new ways. The curriculum is not broad. The curriculum in these areas is pretty restricted. So you'll see in grade one, maybe you learn addition and subtraction in math. In grade 2, you might review that. You might start a little bit with multiplication. Grade 3, you're doing multiplication. Grade 4, you're doing division. Grade 5 is when you introduce algebra. You don't introduce it before the children have mastered the skills leading up to. So then what is the ultimate result and the purpose of the education? It's so that, and when I talk about each of these paradigms, I'm going to talk about it on a personal level and then on a societal. So on a personal level, this rationalist educational model is supposed to result in an independent adult with civilizational knowledge. And by civilizational knowledge, I mean, the big compendium of knowledge that human history has accumulated to date and no further, because we can't predict the future. So anything that's talking about jobs of the 21st or 22nd century or critical thinking skills, that is not a rationalist curriculum because, of course, we don't know that. As an example, 5 years ago, everyone was saying, oh, we've got to start computer coding in grade 1. That's the job of the future. And now we find ourselves that coding is now taken over by AI and there are no jobs in coding. So, that's again, what we're doing is we're educating students for everything that we know to now. And then they go forth in their adult life, they decide on what career, what job they're going to do, what more they're going to learn. And that's really left up to them. Societally, we want to instill a sense of duty and responsibility to fellow citizens, to the nation. So feeling a sense of being Canadian is very important when we're talking about this country. So that's rationalism. So rationalism gave way around the 1970s. It starts, but it really peaked in the 2000s to progressivism. So progressivism has a whole different view. Progressivism looks at every child as a genius, that if released from the bonds of civilization, that they will travel, they will run through the fields and they'll be creative and motivated, and they're going to create their own knowledge and they're going to work together cooperatively with other children. All we have to do in terms of being a teacher, and this is the second picture underneath, is free the child. We have to get rid of all the oppressive constraints on children so that they'll be creative. And what about stuff like reading and writing and math and geography? Well, that's less important. I mean, a teacher can kind of inject that in while the kids are doing their projects or their play or whatever, but it's not necessary and it's kind of loosey-goosey, which means that this style of education benefits the middle and upper classes whose parents actually worry about whether or not their children are reading and writing, and then who either hire tutors or they're running homeschool after school in order to get their kids to do it. But at school, the kids are learning pretty much nothing other than, the ones who are extremely motivated, perhaps extremely smart, they'll be fine. The poor kids you can forget about. They're going to, construct their own knowledge all the way to a learning disability. And so, what is the purpose of that? Well, on the personal realm, it's all about self-esteem, that we want children to feel good about themselves, that they are good people. And societally, that we've decided that in under progressivism, that the goal of education is so that you become a lifelong problem solver, that all the problems in your life you're able to solve because in your, once you've been unleashed from the constraints of this society, that you will naturally be solving your own problems and solving the problems of others in cooperation with them. So this began to give way in the 2000s, and it really went big in 2015, and then went over the top in 2020 with the George Floyd incidents in the States with criticalism. Now, the academic underpinnings of all of these movements predate when I'm talking about them entering the classroom, but really, you start seeing it in the curriculum, in the pedagogy around the 2000s, and then it goes really big. So what are we starting with? We're starting with that every child has a group identity, and that group identity is either oppressed or oppressor. And basically, if you have European heritage, if you're male, if you're straight, there's sort of rules that have to do with this. Has nothing to do with whether or not you grew up in foster care, whether or not you come from a two-parent family, whether or not your family had any money or resources. Nothing to do with that. It has to do, are you white or are you of color? Are you straight or are you gay? Are you, and now the latest one is, do you just have your sex, or now do you have a gender identity that's separate from your sex? So what is the purpose of the teacher? The purpose of the teacher is to help the students free themselves from oppression. And they do that by really emphasizing your group identity is oppressed, and whatever, and it doesn't matter what subject matter they're talking about. You always do it through the lens of look how oppressed these marginalized groups are, and it's unfair, and therefore we basically have to have a revolution, and we have to remake society. So even though you don't know anything about society, you haven't learned anything, you haven't learned anything about experts in the past and the problems that they confronted and how that turned out, for example. We let children at it, and whatever their youth culture is that they bring into the classroom, they should be free to do it. So if their youth culture is kind of to do with gangs, if it's anti-academic, if it's anti-study, if it's antisocial, that's fine. Like we're going to use that. We're going to use that so that the children really focus on their own oppression. And so, what is the result of that? Well, on a personal level, we want to make sure that everyone is has an identity around their mental health. And when I say mental health, I'm not talking about that we want to make sure that everyone is mentally healthy. To the contrary, we want to make sure that everyone is focused on their mental health and that they have little to no resilience, so that anything that punctures that, whether it be a personal failure, not getting a good mark, getting bullied, having someone say something mean to you, that affects your mental health, because any oppression gives you power. And societally, we're going to overthrow society and create some sort of socialist utopia. But in any of the academic writing by educationists, you won't find, what that's going to look like, how it's going to come about, what we can expect from it. You're just supposed to sign on to it in general. Now, what about, reading, writing, math, geography, or whatever? Well, those aren't considered important. Those are considered matters of whiteness and Eurocentrism. We idealize the way that non-European societies live, not actually how they lived historically, but rather we've created myths around them. Like, it's sort of in itself, it's racist. It's this idea of the noble savage, and so we elevate that. And whether children learn anything else is not really important. But of course, to the parents, then of course the parents are stuck in the position of that they have to run a homeschool or send their kids to tutoring. So the tutoring industrial complex has gone nuts since the 2000s, because the schools can't, in a 7-hour day, 5 days a week, accomplish teaching children knowledge. So when I'm talking about teaching, there's two aspects to it. There's the curriculum and pedagogy. So curriculum is the responsibility of the provincial Ministry of Education, and so every province will have it. But generally, the curriculum in every province is mostly the same. And the reason it's mostly the same is because we're basically copying what the Americans are doing, and we always have. So whatever the trends are in the States, we'll copy them, and we'll erase the Canadian context. We'll just adopt them, and then they become so. When they in the States came out with, mathematics is so boring, you have to memorize your multiplication tables. Let's have new math where you color and you discover patterns or whatever. Well, then Canada just adopts it. Now, does it actually help children learn math? Is it going to help them doing algebra or geometry? Well, that's irrelevant, because we don't want to test it, because testing, of course, would harm children's mental health. So we have no way of knowing whether or not these things help. So that's really the responsibility of the provincial Ministry of Education. You have an issue with the curriculum, you go to your Minister of Education. That's the person responsible. So now we move over to pedagogy. And here I've got two pictures. On the left is a picture that is more rationalist. It's the idea that the front of the classroom is the focus. The teacher is delivering a lesson with active student participation, but there's nothing distracting the students. The teacher is the focus. The students may be coming up to the board to do their work. The teacher is constantly monitoring their work, etc. And then we contrast that with a progressive and, in this case, perhaps even a criticalist classroom, overly decorated. Um, you know, we wonder why kids have ADHD, if there is such a thing as ADHD or attention deficit swell. I mean, you tell me how much, a 6 or 7 year old is going to concentrate in a room that's decorated like this. Why would you look at a boring teacher when you can be looking at all that paper mache and rainbows and diagrams and all the other stuff that's there? So whose responsibility is the pedagogy? Again, the Provincial Ministry of Education, as well as faculties of education at our universities. And both of those are influenced by the College of Teachers, who usually will, in most provinces, will be the one to certify the teachers as being able to now teach, and the teachers' unions. So generally, you will find that the paradigm that is being followed, whether we're talking about rationalist, progressivist, or criticalist, um, these are they're not in conflict with each other. The Provincial Ministry of Education is in cahoots with the teachers' unions and the College of Teachers, the faculties of education. They're all on the same page. They may argue about budget, but the fact of the matter is they're all on the same page. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about my research. So I looked at, and I'm using Ontario as an example, all of the ministry documents that were available online. I started this research during the pandemic. Between 1982 and 2022, nearly 700 policy documents covering everything from curriculum, pedagogy, budgeting documents, etc. But generally, the findings that I'm going to show you exclude those budgeting documents, and that I'm only dealing with documents that would affect children in the classroom and the teacher in the classroom. So that would be the curriculum and pedagogy. So if you look, obviously, from the graph, 1982 to 1986, I did in 5-year time periods because, of course, every year the ministry is not producing new curriculum or new policy documents. But in a 5-year period, we could sort of say, well, let's compare, 4 or 5-year periods and see how that looks. And you can see in 1997, this whole thing with critical theory, which, other people, will call woke. That's where it first makes its appearance, and then it grows in the 2000s. And, Ontario, it crests in 2016, and it lowers very slightly in 2017, but that's because there was a real push to bring out new curriculum in 2012 to 2016, and less so in 2017 to 2022. But as you can see, there's astronomical growth. In fact, in terms of those critical terms like identity, anti-Black racism, discrimination, homophobia, transphobia, etc., those kinds of words, any of the pedagogy directed toward them, project-based learning, inquiry-based learning, discovery learning. There's been a 1,730% increase in criticalist language since 1997. All right, so now let's compare that to rationalist pedagogy terms. And by that I mean what we've been talking about, what you would normally think of as the tools that a teacher would have to have. So, here we're talking not just traditionally about how teachers teach, but there's now a whole body of learning science, which has been going on since the 1950s, which is testing sort of our common sense notions of what is a teacher, what is a teacher doing. And in fact, has mostly validated what had been done for hundreds of years, but has actually gone in and said, but here we're going to be even more specific about here's methods that are going to work for everyone. It doesn't matter your socioeconomic level, it doesn't matter whether you come from a home with lots of resources or not, it doesn't matter if your parents read to you or not. These are things that work in any classroom if you follow. So we see that this was never popular during this period of time. If one were able to go back and look at maybe the 1940s and the 1950s, we would see we wouldn't see any criticalist terms, but we would see a lot more terminology that would align with things like phonics, phonemic awareness, multiplication, learning your multiplication tables, learning geography, direct instruction from the teacher, those kinds of terminologies. So we see even in 2002 to 2006, minimal rationalist pedagogy terms. Progressivism had already taken over, as I said previously. And then, boop, in 2007 to 2011, we see the first appearance of criticalist terms in pedagogy and curriculum documents of ministry. And now let's look at the next 4-year period or 5-year period, 2012 to 2016. And you can see that it just zooms. By 2017 to 2022, the rationalist pedagogy terms have completely disappeared from the curriculum. They're gone. All we have left is criticalism. So what are we seeing? When we look at this, a 94% decrease in learning science terms. And that's what I'm talking about in terms of rationalist. A 228% increase in critical pedagogy terms. A 2,060% more critical pedagogy terms than rationalist pedagogy terms over this 20-year span of ministry policy. And I would surmise that the same would be true in every province. All right, so let's dig in a little bit deeper. Let's talk about the reading wars, the elementary school language curriculum, how to teach children to read and write. Ontario had an old curriculum, 2006, and the Human Rights Commission came out with a report called the Right to Read Report, and basically slapped everyone from the ministry down to the faculties of education, to the teachers' unions, to the Ontario College of Teachers, and said, you've embraced these progressivist methods, and now you've embraced this criticalism, where your concerns are all about socio-cultural matters that have very little to do with education, and we're failing our children. And some of those statistics were just frightening. Like 40% of the graduating workforce in Canada is functionally illiterate, meaning that they cannot read and write at the grade 10 level. 30% of students in grades 3, grade 6, and grade 9 are also unable to read. And in Ontario, we have testing where the teachers are actually allowed to read the question on the test to the student and then write the answer for it. So that includes them. So if we were to take that out, you can only imagine what the level would be. Plus, students can be excused if you have an IEP, an independent educational program, because you've been designated as learning disabled, and most learning disabilities are dyslexia, which mostly doesn't exist. They even cite the fact that if you use proper reading and spelling and writing methods, that 95 to 98% of children will learn to read. We're talking about a tiny percentage. So when we've got over 30% of children unable to do so, that's a big problem. And so the Human Rights Commission said, focus on rationalist, what the learning science is, not criticalist methods. So what did the government do? All right. So we see in 2006, there was about equal criticalist and rationalist terminology in the curriculum. And so they were admonished by the Human Rights Commission, and what happens when they come out with their new curriculum? Also about equal, in fact, a little bit more critical theory language, like the woke language, the sociocultural concerns, but basically just this giant increase. They've just stuffed the curriculum full of it. So we see between these 2 years, an over 2,000% increase in the use of criticalist terms, or the criticalist term identity, because that's the big one for critical theory, right? We want to build children's identities as either oppressed or oppressor. So that's their big concern. A 2,000% increase of a term that was unknown in educational circles before this. A 243% increase in the use of DEI terms. So we know we're talking about equity, diversity, inclusion. Again, what this has to do with reading, I don't know. I don't know what it has to do with spelling or literature. There's certainly no studies saying that any of these things help. In fact, the studies say the opposite. We know how to get children reading. We're just not doing it. The government has made their decision. All right, Math Wars, elementary school math curriculum, 2005 to 2020. So we can see here that there was a little bit of criticalism in the 2005 math curriculum. As you know, that was a fad that was taking on, and more than double the amount in terms of rationalism. So they, while they still were not by this point in favor of children memorizing anything or having to practice anything, it was a little bit there. And then what happens? They revised the curriculum on the guidance of experts, and the criticalism terms increased by 815%. Now, there is an increase in rationalist terms, but in comparison between the two, you can see that in terms of the rationalist terminology, the stuff that you need in a curriculum for a teacher to know how to teach and what to teach, that it's much less than the sociocultural concerns. There's 63%, well, almost 64% more criticalism than rationalist pedagogy terms in the 2020 curriculum. And between the two curricula, we see a 413% increase in DEI terminology. So, did Ontario having a conservative back to basics government help? I was very interested in this question, and this one surprised me. So if we look at the McGuinty and Wynne Liberals from 2003 to 2018 and what they were doing with the ministry compared to Doug Ford's progressive conservatives, and the study ended in 2022, of course, he's still in power, we can see that under the Ford's PCs, there's been an 83% increase in criticalism terms in both curriculum and pedagogy documents. So it appears that either nobody is tending the house, the ministers of education don't know what's going on in their bureaucracy, and the ed schools, the teachers' unions, and the teachers' colleges are just doing what they like, which is to compete with each other for this kind of, critical, we're going to overthrow society, even though they don't really need to overthrow society. This is just, what they discuss. Because, of course, if they overthrew society and they had a socialist utopia, they wouldn't be making six figures of salary. So that's where we're left. I'm just going to leave this contact information up for a second if you want to write down my email address, or you can get it